Entering Snowdonia National Park for a visit to the Mawddach Estuary with a small preview of what is to come.
Staying at Swaninant certified caravan location.
The Penmaenpool River runs nearby.
Just 2 caravans to park up in this area.
A nearby shed shows evidence of the high rainfall that Wales experiences.
On the other side of the river, a holiday cottage.
The caravan is pitched, time for a riverside stroll.
The horses are not just keen to meet us as we are to meet them.
Following the Penmaenpool River leads to the entrance to Coed Abergwynt Woods. No horses, no cycling.
Following the road to the Mawddach River, enjoying the serenity and marvel at the huge trees. Man-made, that is clear, but for what purpose?
Penmaenpool River to our left and reed beds to our right. Where the water seems to be flowing freely through the reeds as the tide turns.
A burst of red among the grey rocks and green foliage. A sheep and her lamb graze the rich reeds.
The Mawddach Estuary looking from seaward to landward. Looking back at the gates to Coed Abergwynt Woods, part of which we have just walked through. Plant identified as Sedum anglicum huds, English stonecrop.
Supper still to be cooked, a last look across the estuary. A new day, taking the driveway to the main road.
A short trip where we will base up at the George III Inn, earliest buildings from about 1650. It is in Penmaenpool where there is a wooden toll bridge, which was built in 1879 to replace a ferry crossing.
We pay 30 pence each to cross and will pay the same again on our return.
The bridge has its own poem, which goes in part:
Beams and bolts crisscross the tide, span athwart the waterside. Tempered iron, ancient oak, groan and moan, creak and croak. The bridge stands proud through sun and rain, stead strong as moons wax and wane. A work of art to feed the soul, small price to pay, a token toll. It's rough and bouncy for my mobility scooter.
Indulge me as I try some different views with my 360-degree capable camera. Cars under 2.5 tons can use it, as well as motorbikes, and they drive across very slowly.
Lady Bond, shaken and stirred. Quite a long bridge, a fun little side trip.
Fantastic to be walking on history. To the George III Hotel, where lunch was accompanied by a pint of unicorn golden ale.
Dawn, a new day, a new adventure.
I plan to walk across the railway walking bridge at the mouth of the Mawddach River. Stop! What warning is this? I know trolls to be supernatural, human-like beings. They can be dangerous, evil, and unfriendly to humans. Should I pass this point, I must be sure to pay my troll toll. A train approaches and rattles past. The bridge has been trestles until now, where iron girders frame the portion over the deepest part of the river. Here be the notice to pay the toll, £1. I think to continue, but heed the warning we just heard. My £1 rattles in to keep the troll happy. Down on the beach to admire the view. The bridge and the long line of trestles keeping it above the waterline. Housing in Barmouth, these have views to forever out to sea. I could quite happily live in a mini castle like this. The end of the day, with lots of walking.
A ride to the peninsula opposite Barmouth on the Fairbourne Railway allows us to take the ferry across to Barmouth.
The ferry arrives. There are a good number waiting for the crossing.
Not us this trip. Some passengers took the time for a paddle. Like these folks on the next trip, we're soon at the quay in Barmouth.
These selfish bikers were stopping two crews from getting their inflatables to get them out to their moored boats. A sculpture, The Last Haul, shows 3 generations of fishermen hauling in their net. Ironically, the Carrera marble came from a shipwreck discovered off the coast of Barmouth in 1978.
A pity the fountain with dolphins was not working. This roundhouse was a prison, women on the one side and the men on the other.
Strolling around Barmouth gave us an appetite for this tasty lobster thermidor. I keep a watchful eye on this gull, who is keeping a watchful eye on my food, hoping I might drop my guard.
Time to catch our ferry to cross the river to board the train.
Gentle bump here, guys. Little bump. It's a bit like hitting an iceberg. You ready? Bump. Bump. There we go.
The whistle, the green flag. Our train is on its way back to Fairbourne. Where I do some filming towards our video of the Fairbourne Railway.
Click the link in the description to see our video, Fairbourne Railway June 2024. Thanks for watching.